You might notice that I'm wearing a letter jacket. I haven't worn a letter jacket in in a long time. And it has to do with tonight's presentation. I'm from Norwood, Colorado. I live here in the San Luis Valley now, but I grew up in a small ranching town, a highly Anglo town at that. A town in which there wasn't a whole lot of ethnic diversity. There's more now than there used to be in the past. But when I was growing up, I had an experience while playing sports that I think relates in many ways to tonight's discussion. And so I just want to relate that to you, and then I'll go into the title and introduce my co-presenter, Tori Martinez, and we'll get on with tonight's presentation. I was in 8th grade. I was a stats boy for the varsity basketball team, and Antonito was at the Norwood Shootout. Antonito, of course, if you don't know, is just south of here, is a highly Hispanic town and has deep roots in the region, long before the region was part of the United States, in fact. Antonito was beating us quite handedly. They were up about 15, and the crowd, my home crowd, became a bit disconcerted, and there were comments that started floating about the crowd and being screamed out towards players on the court. And I was, keeping assists and keeping rebounds and doing what I was told to do, right? And these comments, an Antonito player would hit the floor and someone would scream, "Get the grease off the floor," or somebody would scream out, "Go back to your country." And when I look back on this experience, and there are more of these comments, and I'll hold back on sharing all of them, but when I look back on this experience, I realized that I didn't have the educational foundation to understand where this came from, where the tension between these two groups came from. In doing the interviews that we've done over the last year and a half, 2 years, we've heard a lot about sporting events as kind of being that moment when towns with different groups and different ethnic and racial groups come together, and those tensions are learned in ways that unfortunately are not always forgot. And so I wanted to share that experience with you because it's an experience that really led me when I moved to the San Luis Valley after graduate school at the University of New Mexico to think more deeply about these issues and think about where these tensions had come from as a means of trying to think about how we can overcome them. And I share a bit of sad news. I received an email from President McClure here not too long ago. I don't know how many people knew this, but there was a House Bill 1036 that was designed to take money out of the private prison industry in our state and put it towards ethnically diverse education within our K-12 system. Unfortunately, that was turned down. And what that means to me after looking at the votes is that unfortunately not enough has changed. The votes were party, they went down the party lines. Republicans voted against it, mainly rural, and Democrats voted for it, mainly. And so as you watch the presentation that we have for you tonight, I hope that you keep that in the back of your mind, because I think in pressuring politicians and pressuring our representatives for change, first we have to be cognizant of what happened. And so that's what tonight is about. Tonight is about talking about the generational effects of discrimination within the context of ranching and farming in the San Luis Valley. And we've titled our talk "Forever is Temporary" because we oftentimes get caught up in this idea that racial and ethnic tensions are hard and fast, that they've always been there and they will always be here. And in fact, they can change. And I think anyone in here in this room that was part of movements in the 60s and 70s could attest to the fact that things have changed over the years. But of course, there's still lots of work to do. And so that's the title of our talk. At this point, what I would like to do is transition to the next slide. And I'm going to present Tori Martinez, who's going to introduce the larger project, Voices of the Valley, that we started about 2 years ago. And she'll talk to you about kind of the wider scope of what we've been doing. And then we'll come back into a focus on the specific issue, which is Garcia versus Vilsack. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Tori.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. Can everybody hear me? Okay. So I'm Tori Martinez. I'm a Valley native. I'm born and raised here, and my family has always been here. This has always been my home. In 2014, Dr. Waddell asked me to partner with him on the Voices of the Valley project. And through some generous funding from the Bureau of Land Management, Title V here at Adams State University, and more recently, the Sangre de Cristo National Heritage Area, we've been able to incorporate our research project into Dr. Waddell's Field Studies and Sociology course. And our idea was to involve ASU students, much like myself. I graduated from ASU, and so I started the project in my last year while I was here. And so we wanted to involve ASU students into helping us conduct ethnographic research throughout the San Luis Valley. In the first year of the project, we interviewed about 20 Valley residents, and there were certain themes that started to come out from all of those interviews that everybody seemed to be talking about. For example, everybody was talking about rural education or rural health care or music and culture or land and water issues. So now that our project is in the second year, we thought it would be easier for our students to focus on one specific issue. And so this year they focused on land loss due to discriminatory lending practices that took place here in the Valley. And we'll expand on that more as we go on through the evening. And so that's what our students have been working on. We've interviewed about another 20 residents from the Valley. So we've got a little over 40 interviews so far. In 2015, we created a short documentary with the help of Chris Quintana, who is floating around here somewhere. And he did an amazing job on that. And that won Best Picture in the Southern Colorado Film Festival. And so this year we're working on doing a feature-length documentary from what we're doing. And I just want to take time to thank Steve Emmel. He is a photographer that we met during this process who was doing a lot of work here in the Valley, and he has graciously allowed us to include his photographs. So the photographs that you see tonight in our presentation are from Steve Emmel, and he did a great job of that. So the question that we wanted our students to focus on was, how do issues like poverty, inequality, ethnicity, and the other intersections that influence the way we interact with each other and with our natural environment?
So for everyone that doesn't know Cubano, Victor Hernandez is Alfonso Aveda's sheep herder. And so I introduce you to Cubano. There's a purpose to this. Tonight's story is about a lot of different things, but it is mainly about the discriminatory lending practices over the 20th century in the Valley. But I wanted to share with you how we came to this question. And so for that, I want to share 3 short stories and a graph, 2 graphs really with you, which led to kind of the main question that drove the interview process that led to the clips that you'll see here shortly. So about a year ago, I was down talking to Aaron Abeda, who is an English professor here, local rancher, educator, mayor of Antonito. The list goes on, but Aaron said, you know, why don't we go down and you should meet a Cubano. He's our sheep herder, and I was going to Cuba a few weeks later. It seemed fitting, right, to meet somebody who's been here since the 70s from Cuba before going to Cuba. It didn't work out. I ended up going to Cuba. I came back, and then I was going a month later to take students. So between that juncture, I got in a car at 5 in the morning, drove down to Antonito, did as Aaron told me, got a box of donuts. Cubano likes donuts. And we go down this dirt road. We get close to the sheep herder's trailer, and Aaron says, about 100 yards out, he says, stop here and let me go tell Cubano what's going to happen, because you just never know when he's going to show up with a gun and no pants, I think he said. And so, just an amazing interview, right? We talked to Cubano for about 2 hours. Fascinating fellow, comes in 1965 to this country on a boat that probably tried to capsize several times. Just a really fascinating character. But the point of this story is really what happened next. We got back in the car. We get back onto 285. We had a few donuts left, so we're eating. And Aaron goes, "Do you have a minute?" And there was a juncture coming up, and so I sensed that he meant, do you have some time for a detour? And I said, yeah, of course. And so we drove down to San Antonio and Ortiz. And Aaron, for those of you that don't know, is a very powerful poet. And he poetically, literally, just starts bringing these small towns back to life. Right? He starts describing the kids in the school and where they used to play and how they cross the roads and play in the ditch. We get to Ortiz, and he starts telling me about the old men that would drink till 2 in the morning and cross over to New Mexico to get 1 more hour, right? Because the times were different. And then I started asking questions about what had happened. What had happened to these towns? He started telling me on the way back some sadder stories. Stories of people leaving, stories of people not being able to get the funding they needed to keep farming, stories of people losing everything they had in less than a generation, things that had been in place for more than generations, for hundreds of years, right? And he mentioned Garcia versus Vilsack. And I, for the life of me, did not remember Vilsack. I remember Garcia, though, and so I put a V with a period in, and I started researching it, looking it up when I got home. And it pushed me to look at demographics in the valley in a way that I'm a demographer, I study migration, so naturally I went to data. And I saw something that really astounded me. In Conejos County, and this is just for Conejos County, which is where Antonito is, which is right to the south, north of New Mexico. In Conejos County, which was one of the first areas settled by Hispanics in the 1850s and 60s, median income for whites is over $40,000. For Hispanics, it's around 25. There's a $16,000 difference between these two. That's a huge difference in a space in which the economic opportunity structures are really quite similar. And so there was one of two things in my mind. Either one group is better at farming and ranching than the other, or there's something that happened over the 20th century that was unfair in terms of opportunity structures for the Hispanic group. And so that led to looking at population loss. I was interested in seeing what had happened to the populations across these counties. If you look at these closely over time from 1950 moving forward, Conejos County lost population. Alamosa has gained. A lot of people come to Alamosa naturally. Costilla County really has lost population, especially by 2000. But if you look at Rio Grande and Saguache County, which they have a much stronger population of Anglos, one of the things that you'll notice is that population has been very steady. And in fact, it's increased in Saguache. And so when we look at these numbers, it leads to a question. And that question is really kind of what we're trying to answer through the interviews that we've been doing and what we'll try and get at tonight. So the question is, how, if at all, are social and economic disparities, such as the ones I just showed you, related to the historic discrimination and unequal access of resources? And so throughout the night, you might just keep in mind a shorter version of this. How is unequal opportunity structures equal to what happened and what you'll be hearing and listening to? So a brief outline. We're going to talk about the history of Hispanic settlements. We're going to talk about generational loss of both land and psychological and mental loss, and just loss in general. We're going to talk about personal accounts, and we'll have a series of conclusions for you. Each of these segments we'll talk about briefly, and then we'll let the individuals that we actually interview talk. And so we have clips from all of these, some of whom are in the room, so hopefully we chose the right clips. But what we'll really be doing is trying to tell tonight's story through the perspective of the actual people that we've talked to. So the first part of the segment that we want to look at is, I just labeled La Historia, history, right? And we'll start with Demetrio Valdez. Demetrio is from near Antonito. He lives just south of town with his wife Olive. He will describe in this clip just how deep his ties to this region are. I'll just give you a brief anecdote from our interview with him. You can't really see it, but this is a wagon wheel, right? His table is a piece of glass over a wagon wheel. It's just a beautiful table. But on top of that wagon wheel, there's a spur. And this spur he brought out and he started showing it to me, and it's clearly handcrafted. And there's a part where Hispanics came through during the first exploration of the valley, and there was a camp, and it's on his land. And he'd found that spur in doing some digging and construction in that area. And so his ties, as you'll see, are really quite deep.
Well, 1694 is the first on that De Vargas expedition. Even the first one of my relatives to go way back, go on that expedition and climbed those hills and saw the San Luis Valley. And since then, it took 100 years for them to get a land grant. 5 generations later, they got a land grant from Spain. They called it El Valle donde nace el Río del Norte, in the valley where the Río del Norte starts. And they got a land grant from Spain, the first land grant for the whole valley. Because nobody been out here, They just told the people in Spain there's a big valley where the Rio del Norte starts. They came a land grant. Then after Mexico won the independence from Spain, then they applied for a land grant from Mexico, but they broke it up into the Costilla land grant, the Baca Grande, the Zapata, and then the Conejos. But the Conejos was still the big one from the Rio Grande's way. From the San Antonio Mountain north, from La Garrita south, and then to the timberline.
So of course there's a much larger and deeper history of the land grants in the valley and the loss of land grants, especially in Conejos County. The land grant was never recognized by the government, and so a huge percentage of that county is now national forest land and or run by the BLM. And so the land grant history, of course, is extremely important, but what you see there is just how deep these ties run for many people in the southern part of the valley. Dennis Lopez, who was kind enough to introduce me, and has been kind enough to host this over the last several years, the Lifeway segment, is going to talk here about that settlement period during the 1850s and 60s, and he'll describe what that looked like during that time period.
The Spaniards arrived in Mexico in 1492, time of Columbus. The conquest of Mexico itself was 1519 through 1521. Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1820. So from the 1400s, 1492 till 1820 was 300 years. And then from 1820 until 1848 is when what used to be called New Spain or Mexico revolted against Spain and then became Mexico. And so the people for 300 years were Spanish, and then from 1920 to 1948, for 28 years, they were Mexican, and then 1848, all this was taken over by the U.S., and people then became U.S. citizens. So there was this long history mentality of we're Spanish, and then for just one generation we're Mexican, and so which of those is going to be the stronger thought, influence? Is Spanish. So you still hear people here in the valley saying that they're Spanish. When the soldiers had gone off to war and then returned from the war, one of the things they realized was that when they were soldiers and they had stripes on their arm, that they weren't judged by the color or by their language or by their height or by their weight or anything else. They were judged by the stripes on their shoulder. So if they got to be officers, they were treated as officers. And then when they came back home, they come back home to the feeling of there's first class and second class citizen. And they were treated as second class citizens.
So Dennis is describing the experience of individuals coming back from war in this part of the segment, right? And that shock of having felt what it is to be accepted and working towards a national cause, and then that rejection that people felt as they came back into the home communities that they'd been born into. And that period that he described first, that initial settlement of Hispanics in this region, happens at just around and right before 1848, when the Treaty of Guadalupe makes what is the majority of the Southwest, what was Mexico and Spain before that, it makes it the United States. And for many individuals, that discrimination he was describing in coming home from war began there. Because all of a sudden the whole system was in English. Everything you would need to access resources was in a different language, and it was under a different series of laws, and it was working with a different set of people. And so the people that had the social capital and the networks and what they needed to get ahead in life in the Spanish period was flip-flopped, right? And so all of a sudden you had a new group of people through Manifest Destiny settling this region of the valley. And that conflict starts really then as these two come together. And so one of the things that I always keep in mind from a political perspective that's interesting to reflect on is Colorado becomes a state in 1876. We're the centennial state. New Mexico does not become a state until 1911. 1912, it officially becomes part of the Union. And the reason for that is because our representatives in Congress and in Senate did not want to bring in a state that had such a high Native population and such a strong population of people who spoke Spanish. And the only reason Colorado was brought in earlier is because of money, mining, and agriculture, but mainly mining. And so at this point, what we want to turn to is some of the generational loss and the stories that we encountered of generational loss that happens after this period of initial settlement and as Hispanics and Anglos begin to coexist within this valley. And so for that, I'm going to turn it over to Tori.
So what you've heard so far is a theme of the locals really being connected and rooted to the land. It's more than just a piece of dirt where you grow something. This is home. This is their livelihood. And so we'd like to introduce you to this first clip, which is Rita Martinez, my mother. And I grew up on a farm. I was raised on a farm. So were both of my parents. And so my mother is going to briefly explain what it was like for her to grow up on a farm, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it after.
My dad had this property up higher from where we lived. There he used to plant potatoes, big fields of potatoes. And we had to go and help him irrigate it and pick them and pick them and put them in sacks and then haul them to the cellar. I still remember picking potatoes after me and my husband got married. My mom kept all where we had our home, our house, and my mom kept everything, you know, the property where our house was at and everything, but my dad was just leasing where he planted potatoes and the beans.
So you see this moment where she wipes the tears away so we don't see them, but it's because she's remembering what it was like when her father no longer had access to funds to be able to keep the farm going, and so they lost that part of that. They lost that land. And so she was talking about her mother being able to keep the part where their home was, but they lost the rest of it. And so the next clip that we're going to go into kind of continues on her story. And this is Michelle Treehill. She is the principal of Guadalupe Elementary School in the South Conejo School District. And she continues the story of what happens to Hispanic identity when they lose their land and they lose their livelihood that they've known their whole life.
When things like land are taken or sold and people cannot have that attachment like they're innately born to do, I think that causes pain. And they go off searching for things that they can do in this world that can make as much of a difference. And sometimes they can't find that. And sometimes they have no means to leave. And so they have to numb their pain somehow. And they can't take care of their family. And maybe they don't feel much like a role model or a provider. They feel like they're a loser. And so they have to numb that. So you just keep covering it up and covering it up. And sometimes the alcohol doesn't work enough. So then you choose something else and something else and something else. And then all the while, it's pain at the root and loss.
So I think Michelle did a really great job of just kind of explaining the emotional ties and what happens to Hispanic farmers when they lose everything that they've ever known. This next clip is of Olive Valdez, and you met her husband earlier, Demetrio. And we had a great time at their house. Olive is she is so funny and she is wonderful. And so here she's going to talk about what it was like to marry into someone who, and his family, who have always been farming. She was never into farming before, but she very beautifully describes what that's like to watch someone struggle to keep their way of life and struggle to keep their land.
I never saw anyone work harder than Demetrio. He worked and he worked and he worked and got so little for all those hours. And I just kept thinking there's got to be some way to help. Demetrio was certainly a prime example of someone who had such a good heart, such a love of the land, and yet wasn't able to make a living wage when he was just working as hard and as smart as he possibly could. So then I wanted to help, and that's why I did all that I could, just to make his life easier. And in return, hoping to make our neighbors' lives easier.
So as we were doing research before we went and interviewed Olive, Ben came across a wonderful clip when Olive was invited to go and speak at an agricultural conference before President Clinton and some of his advisors. And so this next clip is just her speaking at that conference.
We agreed to cut our subsidy some in that, and we sent a budget up that did that. But our European competitors had to cut even more because they were subsidizing more. We don't want to turn around and give away everything we won in the trade negotiations by the way we do the farm bill. So I think you've made a very important point. That doesn't mean that we're doing enough to preserve the family farms, but getting rid of this without knowing what we're going to substitute for it under the guise of saving money will raise food prices, cost foreign markets, and accelerate the demise of the family farm, in my opinion. I think we have to be very careful how we change it. Olive?
I'd like to tell you that what impacts us most when we take our animals to the sales ring is the fact that there are usually only 3 buyers. We see those 3 buyers for the 3 major companies sitting up in the ring, laughing, talking, and we are terrified. We are scared to death because they can laugh and joke because they're playing with our future. We have no control. We sit there, victims, waiting for them to decide what they'll give for our product. We raise organic foods. We raise organic animals. We have no choice. We don't have the money to buy the fertilizer to fertilize the land. The only fertilizer most of those acres have ever had is the footprints of the owner, which is not all bad. What we would like to see is the antitrust laws enforced. Thank you. I beg your pardon.
No, I was just going to tell you that I mentioned this, we heard this everywhere we went, this issue, and the Packers and Stockyards folks, which is now it's renamed as a reorganization, it's along with Grain Inspection, but they are undertaking a study now which will be completed, I think, by the end of the summer, Rich, is that right? And that is on a variety of concentration issues in the livestock industry, looking at issues of vertical concentration, what the facts are, determining whether we need any changes in the law. So there is a review of that going right now.
Thank you. What we need is to receive a fair price for the quality of our product. We in the Valley, now I'll tell you how much money we have. The per capita income in Canales County, $10,000. The per capita income in Costilla County, $13,000. There are rich neighbors to the north. I don't want you to think we're poor, because we're not poor. We just don't have any money. We have a rich heritage, and we have strong hearts, and we are committed to the American way of life. Don't ever tell me that any farmer doesn't work. Now, I tell you what, my husband came in last week and he was worried, you know, really concerned, because we have a big payment coming up, right? And he came in and he sat down in the chair and his beard was all ice because he had been out. We started calving not too long ago. He came in and he sat down and he said, "Well, babe, how are we going to get the money?" And I thought, "Well, I don't know." And he said, "Well, I'm just going to have to work harder. I'm just going to have to work harder." Now, here sat this man that had been out all day. He was drying off a calf that had had the bad luck to be born when it's cold and the wind was blowing, so it was really chilled. So here we're working, even the dogs are licking the calf, everyone has to help at our house. Anyway, here's a man, his beard is coated with ice. He's telling me that he has to work harder, and he's so exhausted that I had to pull his boots off. Now, don't you tell me the American farmer has it easy, because we'll have to go one-on-one about that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Olive is amazing. We really had a wonderful time. And her and Demetra just shared so much information, and this is just a piece of what they shared. So we're going to go on to the next clip. And so for this, I'm going to turn it over to Ben, and we're going to just kind of go into a little bit more about some of the inequities that exist here in the Valley.
There's something I really enjoy about the way Olive speaks about this issue, because she describes this individual who is working as hard as he could and yet was still running up against barriers, right? And I understand, especially growing up in Norwood, that happens for all farmers, right? This is an issue that cuts across racial and ethnic lines. But there seems to be something different about the history of what faced Hispanic farmers and ranchers and women here in the San Luis Valley and other parts of the Southwest. And so what we'll do now is turn to a number of individuals. First, we'll look at Bob Menendez, who's a representative out of New Jersey, and he'll describe what Garcia versus Vilsack was trying to do. And we'll talk about the case more here in a little bit. But I think the first minute of this clip helps describe that process. There is a kind of a lesson to be learned here in these clips. Never say anything on C-SPAN that you don't want to be found. That's where I found Olive's clip. So.
Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak as a morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise to speak on the floor of what I have addressed in the past. It's about injustice. And it is about the reality that there is no secret that decades of discrimination in lending practices at the United States Department of Agriculture have made it difficult, if nearly not impossible, for minority farmers, specifically Hispanic and women farmers, to make a living at what they love to do, leaving many no choice but to lose their farms and ranches that they have tended all their lives, in many cases from generation to generation. And that's why I rise today in support of parity for Hispanic and women farmers.
So Menendez helps lay out the issue. Garcia versus Vilsack at first was an effort for a class action lawsuit against the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture. It turned into a settlement fund under Obama. The Obama administration came in, and one of the things that he charged the new Secretary of Agriculture with was creating a settlement fund for Hispanic farmers. Native Americans, African Americans, and some others had been compensated for land loss and discrimination of similar magnitude, and Hispanic farmers had not. And so Obama took issue with that in 2008 and created a settlement fund. We'll get to this, but the fund hasn't been all that it lived up to be. And so what I want to start with is Alfonso Abeda, who was kind enough to join us. And Alfonso will start off by describing a little bit about the deep-seated nature or the culture of discrimination that, of course, is not unique to the Valley, but is common throughout the 20th century. So we'll start with the first clip.
So I was raised as a Mormon to start with. So in that time frame when we were all teenagers and all that, my dad would take us to Sunday school in Manassas. So I got to know this young girl, and she liked me and I liked her. And I asked her to go to a movie with me. And she says, yeah, why don't you pick me up at my friend's house? Well, I didn't know that her parents would not allow her to go out with me, a Mexican. And so she acted like she pretended she was sick, so she went to her room, sneaked out the window, and went to her friend's house, and we went to the movie. Of course, the mother went to check on her, and she wasn't there, and find out that she was with me. As I drove into Manassas, her dad and her brother, which is much older than me, they caught me and I couldn't eat but soup for almost, they kicked me, they beat the shit out of me, if you want to. So from that point on, I refused to go to church, in the Mormon church. And of course, I became a Catholic when I was in the Marines.
I share this clip because it's extremely powerful, but I also think it demonstrates something about discrimination that we oftentimes ignore, right? We say we're past these things, discrimination, racial inequities, they don't exist anymore. We're in the 21st century. But if there's a litmus test for discrimination, it's marriage. Try and marry somebody from a different group. And if things still continue along and people keep saying discrimination doesn't exist, etc., then maybe there's been progress. But when you hear stories like this, which turned out wonderful for Martha, I should add, because he, of course, ended up marrying a wonderful woman. You'll get to hear from her shortly. And for Alfonso, yes. But this is a test, right, of where we're at. And of course, this was many years ago, but we still hear, unfortunately, similar stories like this today. So we'll move to the next clip.
We got married in 1961. And at that time, there was a piece of land that was 320 acres available by Aunt Nito. It's what they call it, the Metro Valdez owns that right now, down in that there. And we wanted to purchase that from the Romeros because it belonged to the Romeros. And so I went to the FHA office to try to borrow money to be able to purchase it because I had just got out of the Marine Corps. And one of the things that I remember is, I'll never forget this man. He was an older, his name was Downing. He was the supervisor there, and I went in there to try to borrow money, which was 320 acres. They wanted $45,000 for it. And he didn't even give me an application. He said, I remember his words as of today. He says, your people are supposed to be farm workers, not farm owners or landowners. And I left there so discouraged, and I wish I'd have known then what I know today. I would have gone 100% out. So, and instead of pursuing it through the channels and all that, my wife and I, we moved to Denver and started working.
Something to keep in mind, if we go back to the graph that I showed towards the beginning of the presentation, you might remember the population drop in Costilla and Conejos County. That becomes important to remember because, like Alfonso, many people had left. And unlike Alfonso, most people didn't come back. And so when it comes time to compensate for discrimination, it often comes too little too late. But many times the people that were discriminated against aren't even around. They're not here anymore. And so that'll be something important to remember as we get to the end of the presentation and talk about compensation. The next clip is very short, and it allows Alfonso to speak about how he knew that discrimination was taking place, other than the blatant comments that he was receiving.
Well, coming to find out, in the same month that I got turned down, the superintendent of North Conejos, or at that time in La Jera, was the superintendent. He got over $200,000 and some loan to buy a purchase of land in Manassas.
So one of the things in the Garcia versus Vilsack case that they did is they had people demonstrate discrimination. And keeping documentation became really important. As Aaron pointed out to me, his mother throws nothing away, which turned out to be a real virtue when it came time to demonstrate that the discrimination had actually taken place, because she had records from years and years ago that demonstrated that in fact they'd applied for things and been rejected that on the other parts of the valley, Anglo farmers had been accepted for under very similar conditions, right? So that became extremely important evidence. It also became one of the detriments for many people that were applying for compensation, because not everybody had kept records. Many people, when something like this happens, you leave and you kind of want to leave the memory behind. And that makes it very difficult, right? Later, 40 years later, for example, to demonstrate what actually happened. The next clip we're going to show is from Richard Gomez. Richard he worked for the USDA for many years. He worked for the Farm Service Agency, FSA, which has changed names since. But Richard was an insider. He was somebody that had inside information. And one of the things that I want to point out is a full 95% of people that applied for compensation under the fund that Obama set up were rejected. They were denied. And in this valley, a very high percentage, 80, 90%, somewhere in that range, receive compensation. In part, that's because, unlike in many other parts of the country, there was an inside person who had information, who had witnessed what took place. And so to reveal what he saw, we'll show two clips from him.
Well, you know what, they didn't, there was only a few farmers that got loans. Out of 36, one day I counted in the jurisdiction I had as district director, only 2 Hispanic farmer loans were made out of the 36. They'd always find ways to deny them in some way. There was always a denial. They'd meet with the appraisers and make the appraiser lower the appraisal so they wouldn't give them the money, or they wouldn't give them enough money to operate. You know, they give them a little bit of money, but not enough to make it where they had enough money to operate. And actually, sometimes they broke them because they didn't give them enough money. And like back in when I went to New Mexico, you know, they grow cotton there and chili and all that. Well, and they used to have to plant those in April and at the latest July, and then they wouldn't have the money for them till August. So they couldn't buy the whatever they needed, a tractor or whatever. So they'd break them right away. That was happening all over the country, not just here.
So one of the things that is important to point out is before the Great Depression, before the Great Dust Bowl, this type of funding didn't exist, right, in the way that it existed afterwards. And so subsistence farming and ranching was very common up until that period. After the Great Depression, all these funds are created as part of the New Deal, as part of creating a much more sustainable agricultural base and farming base. And so those plans are put into place, but they come to be operated mainly by Anglos within small towns across the United States. And so one of the things that we see is that the effects of this become much more clear. That is, the discrimination has a much larger impact after the Great Depression as a result of the funds that now were available to people across the United States, but were systematically being kept out of certain people's hands.
I had a case, well, it's not a case, but I went to a meeting in Dallas on discrimination. They were having a discrimination thing, training for all over the country, and I went to that meeting. And then they had telling us how to look for on discrimination and that. But at one of the times that two guys from Colorado got up, the district director and the county supervisor got up and went outside out of the meeting, and then came back, and they had another guy that they had taken out and had him like he was handcuffed, and they were going to ship him back to Mexico. And I rose holy hell about that, because I didn't think they should have been doing, training us with that kind of mock session where they were saying, well, you're applying for a loan, we're going to send you back to Mexico. It's just like Trump saying, well, we're going to send them all back now. So every time I hear Trump say that, I remember about that. And I rose holy hell about that.
Richard's one of these individuals, one of these important people in history who has the ability to stand up time and time again and continue to do so, right? That's not easy to do. And so in watching him and talking to him, the important role that he played within this process can't be overemphasized. It really was extremely important. We now turn to Armando Valdez, who also was kind enough to come tonight. He goes back generations to the area, has a very clear understanding of just how far back his family tree goes. He can trace it all the way to Mexico City. And in talking to Armando, one of the things that he explained to us was just how important the financing is within farming and ranching. And so we wanted to make sure that was clear after listening to these clips, because it emphasizes exactly how pernicious the discrimination that took place was.
Well, financing is essential because it's a highly capitalized or capital-intensive business, and the industry itself, the type of equipment that's used, especially for farming, tractors and cultivation equipment, or if you're in a haying operation, just windrowers and swathers to cut it and rake it and bale it to make sure you have a quality product to sell. There's a huge capital expense. Ranching, little bit less on the financing side, but that doesn't mean it gets away from it completely. Obviously have care for the animals. The animals have value themselves. But ranching, you can grow that operation from your own seed stock or your own operation, with the exception of maybe adding some breed stock. Yeah, for financing for farming, and ranching will use it, just probably not to the same extent. It'll happen, right around March, April. Individuals will be looking to go through a line of credit, which is usually on an annual basis. If they're buying more capital-intense equipment, such as machinery, or putting up some type of outbuilding or storage facility, they may be looking at a longer-term loan rather than just a yearly annual line of credit. And it's mostly through commercial lenders, banks that are offered in the local area that understand ag lending. No, and what I mean by understanding ag lending, in that revenues come around once a year, predominantly in the fall, harvest time, whether it's farming or for ranching. That'll be the predominant time when those revenues come in. And so farmers and ranchers have to be able to sustain on an annual cycle, and a lot of times that money that they did bring in as revenue is starting to run out in that late spring, early summer time frame. So they're having to look to secure financing during that time.
So just because not all of us are ranchers or farmers, but most of us depend on an income, right? And so I'd like you to imagine just for a moment that your income came, maybe in $90,000 per year every 4 or 5 years. But then you would have to go 3 or 4 years making $20,000. And then some years you would actually lose money. And imagine how would you go about doing or going through those hard years if you didn't have access to financing. So you can get a sense of how easy it was to break farmers and ranchers who were now working within this commodified market once this funding was available and it was being given to some and not to others. At this point, we're going to turn to the Garcia versus Vilsack case and squarely focus on what happened. And we're going to look at individuals that received compensation, and we'll talk to them, or we'll have them show you whether or not they think that actually made up for discrimination. We'll also visit a conversation with an individual who did not receive compensation but applied. And then from there, we'll transition into our conclusion.
So as Ben said, we're going to move into the specifics of the case. And the first person that we want to show is Alfonso Abeyta again, and he's going to take us into when he heard about the case and the process of getting that started and applying.
Well, I found out that this Garcia case, he was from Las Cruces, New Mexico. He was a main plaintiff, and I found out about it through Richard Gomez, which he was an employee of the FSA office, but he was like in low-income housing. I don't know if you know Richard Gomez or not. But anyway, he's the one that told me that about the Garcia lawsuit. In fact, his testimony and all that, how they discriminated, and I don't have his declaration, but his declaration gave us how that office discriminated against the Hispanic people.
Now this is Martha Abeyta, and she kind of gives us the story of what it was like emotionally, financially, to have her family go through the process of not having access to those finances and trying to maintain their farm, and what that was like for her family.
Well, when the children were young, it really it affected us in a way that we had to have two homes. We had to live in Denver or Pueblo, wherever we were working at the time, during the week, and then on the weekends we had to travel here because of what we were trying to do with the ranch. We had to come in and work, and the kids had to come and do their chores, whatever it entailed. And so it affected us that way, that we had to we never had much of a life on the weekends because we were here, and then during the week we were there. And the kids had to switch schools, and that kind of affected them. Al, the two oldest ones, we had to, because they were already in junior high, and it kind of, changing schools always, you have to change friends. Yeah. I think the $250,000 that we received was all right, but it could never, ever make up for what we went through, for all the sacrifices we made, for all the things we had to give up, for all the things we couldn't give our kids, college educations and things that, Not anything extravagant, but just it could never. No, the 250,000 is nothing, nothing, and it came a little late. Yeah.
So this next clip is an interview we did with Erin Meeks, and she was working with Congressman Salazar's office at the time when all of this was going on. And so she kind of explains the political process and what that was like for Congressman Salazar, who is a Hispanic, who is a local from this area, and who is tied to the land as much as any of the other people that you have heard tonight, and what that was like for him going through this process.
So I started working for John Salazar in 2007. I moved down here to the San Luis Valley to work for him. And that was probably the first time that I had any real direct communication with any of the claimants who were actively seeking his support in, at that time, what was the effort to get class action certification. And at the time, it was a case in federal court that was under review, and there was not a political solution directly tied to it. And this is a distinction I offer to all of you, is that this was a really fine line that a member of Congress has to walk, and that I understood we had to walk when I was advising him, to what level we could influence a federal judge. So then shortly after that, Senator Mark Udall got elected, and he added an added layer of staff that covered the San Luis Valley on the issue. He actually created a team and had some more targeted interviews with a lot of the claimants. Actually, we did a video interview here with him in 2008. And eventually, about a year in, we had done, we did our own letter through John's office to the Secretary of Agriculture, basically with the plea that they admit to some of these offenses. Some level of agency admission to a pattern of discrimination, just like the Pigford case. When it came to their own financial viability, so many of these cases, because of who had standing and how long ago it had to be, so many of these folks had moved on, had let go of their lives related to agriculture, had been forced to become teachers and administrators and snowplow drivers, and just had to find another way to stay in the valley because they could no longer make a living in agriculture.
So in this next clip, you'll meet Faustine Martinez. And Faustine is a local farmer and rancher who was involved in the Garcia case. He applied for compensation for the program that was set up by the Obama administration and did not receive compensation. So he's going to share his story with us.
Well, shortly after early 80s, it was a conversation. It was like in year 2000, 2001, when we were all fed up with it, and Lupe Garcia from Las Cruces, New Mexico, they were having the same situation down there, and that's when Lupe got together with some attorneys and filed the Garcia versus Vilsack. And it was a long road from then till, well, I think most people got a settlement in 2015. I was denied. I didn't get anything. And I got a letter of denial, and I couldn't believe it because a lot of the people were getting their acceptance letters. And so I called my attorney to see what was going on, and she said, that couldn't be right, something's wrong. So she called over to USDA office, and she kept telling them it's a mistake. If anybody had all the paperwork in line, it was Faustine, and I was one of the original ones that filed way back, and I've been in farming all my life, and still, beginning of this month, she wrote more letters and did an inquiry, and she's trying to get them to review it again because she says it's a mistake. There is no possible way that she could have denied this one and approved a bunch of the others. I think it changed my trust in the legal system. my trust in the political system. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons I say that is I supported and I campaigned for President Obama. And we wrote letters, we made phone calls. Never once did we receive a response. When he was coming to Denver, we took every avenue we could through our Democratic Party leaders and on. Our local legislators, which was the Salazar brothers, and never once could we get a response from Obama. We wanted to meet with him in Denver since he was going to be there and explain our situation and why were they making it so hard for Hispanics. But not once did he ever respond to us.
So it's really interesting to hear from Faustine and his perspective on that, and really wanting just to get some kind of validation from the Obama administration and some kind of response, that they acknowledge what was happening here, and just get some kind of feedback during that process.
So in closing out this section, one of the things that's worth mentioning, I think, is if you look back to Martha's interview, she mentioned that $250,000 didn't compensate for the losses. The Beta family actually had an outside economist estimate how much they could have gained had they been given those loans, a very extensive review. And I've looked quite closely at it. And it estimates somewhere between $2 and $3 million were lost as a result of not having access to loans. Now, if you multiply that across the number of people, perhaps not everybody would have been as strong an entrepreneur as Alfonso and his wife have been. But if you estimate that and you multiply it by the number of people that lost funding through this process, that's a lot of money, right? And that's a lot of loss. And so it's both financial and capital. There was loss, but as you get a sense from watching these videos, there's something psychological about this as well, right? There's something that runs much deeper than money. To end tonight's talk, we want to turn to Aaron Abeda, who's much more poetic and just speaks of this in the way that only somebody who has perhaps been through it can. And so we'll first turn to a clip where he talks about the way in which it's affected communities, his community specifically, and as mayor he has a certain authority in speaking to this. And then we'll turn to a poem of his titled Clouds Like Horses, which get at some of the issues we've been watching tonight.
People like to ridicule and say bad things about our school. They like to say bad things about our community. They like to tell things to our athletes on the court and on the field and stuff like that. But they just don't know. They just don't know. So the obstacles to our community are, liberating people through education, liberating people from drugs and alcohol, liberating people by getting them jobs and giving them that dignity. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, most certainly. And kind of building on that, as mayor, what would you want the outside world to know about your community and the strengths within your community? I mean, it's one thing to focus on weaknesses, but I think that you spoke to a lot of strengths already. What are some of those?
Well, I think that we love each other. I mean, even the people that don't like each other love each other, which is kind of weird. If it came right down to it, I think we would defend each other always. I might be viewed as negative in some contexts, but I think that we're really, really good fighters, and that we know when to fight and what to fight for. And I think that we know our own worth and we know our own history and our own culture. We need to be reminded of it sometimes, but those things are well sources of strength, which I don't think will go away. Yeah, so this is the first time I've ever read this poem, so thank you. I've done hundreds of readings, and for whatever reason this one's never made the reading list. It's called Clouds Like Horses. I am 3 generations of clouds like horses, arching muscles tattooed to the sky by the brown bicepped machismo of the man I call abuelito, who wears a callus of sun thick on his hands, the story of every scar written in the jagged lines of his knuckles that worked the potato farms for 25 cents a day, the bruises left on his memory from swinging a 12-pound sledge for a man who called him a dirty Mexican. I am a man like my father, strong as clouds, thunder built up black in their bellies. The bulging veins tell the cuento about the big Mormon who beat him when he was 16 for daring to date the wrong girl, breaking his skin until the bitterness lingered in his blood. I am 3 generations of clouds like horses, unharnessed, rolling over the llano, a promise rumbling that they will live on.
And to end tonight, I wanted to quote an individual who I read in graduate school, who some might have come across. It doesn't really matter, but he wrote a book called Imagine Communities that talk about how we form nations and communities and how these kind of racial ideals come about in the first place. And it goes, quote, "The fact of the matter is that nationalism thinks in historic destinies, while racism dreams of eternal contaminations, transmitted from the origins of time through an endless sequence of loathsome copulations outside of history." In watching that get turned down, what I'm reminded of is that we don't teach enough of the history as it was. And so if this is anything, and if this night serves as anything, I hope as it serves to push people to revisit history, to talk to people, to their grandparents, to the people around them, to community members, to whoever it might be that you haven't conversed with, that might be different than you, that could tell you a different story than what you think is true. Because through listening to each other's truths, we actually find a truth that is above what we think is true. I'd like to end with that, and thank you. I also want to take a moment to turn to Chris and to Tori, who have been amazing students, have been amazing colleagues in working on this project, and I could never have started a project like this without both of you. It's been amazing to watch you grow as professionals, both working in the community at this point, and I think you're wonderful assets to the community, and also just a great example of what ASU does. So thank you all.